Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the economy in Russia, and specifically to talk about the Russian prison system. Now, prisons all across the world are struggling with increasing prisoner numbers, overcrowding, and funding issues. And over the last 20 years, there has been more than a 30% increase in the number of people being sent to prison. This is a major issue in most countries. However, one of the benefits of the war in Ukraine from Russia's point of view is that its prison population is declining, and in 2023 it fell by more than 10%. And one of the reasons for that is that the Russian army is continuing to recruit people directly from prison and sending them to the front line in Ukraine. So in today's video, we'll take a look at what's happening with prisons globally. We'll look at which countries have the most prisoners out of all of the countries in the world, and we'll also look at which countries have the highest percentage in terms of the size of their population, because the figures are quite different. We'll then take a look at what's going on in Russia. We'll have a look at their statistics and what's happening with regards to prisoner numbers. We'll have a look at the direct recruitment of Russian prisoners that was undertaken by the Wagner Group in 2022. That situation was then replaced by what's called Storm Z units, where Russia has been directly recruiting, and Storm Z has now been disbanded and replaced by Storm V. And then finally today I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think the implications of Russia recruiting soldiers directly from prisons is on the war in Ukraine and also on the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've signed up as a long-term supporter, either through Patreon, where you can get early access to my videos and watch them without any adverts, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you for that long-term support. Really helps to keep me motivated, keeps me focused, keeps me thinking up more videos to post on a regular basis. And if you've sent me a YouTube super thanks or bought me a coffee recently, thank you for the time and effort that you've taken to do that. Really, really appreciate your support. This table shows the world prison population levels split out by continent. And what this shows is that there are currently around 11 million people serving prison sentences in prison. The continent with the most prisoners is Asia, where there are 4.3 million prisoners out of a total population of 4.6 billion, which means that out of every 100,000 of population, around 95 people are in prison. The second highest continent is North and South America, where around 3.7 million people are currently imprisoned out of a population of just over 1 billion, and that equates to a prison population rate of 357 out of 100,000, by far the highest rate of any of the continents. Europe is the continent with the third highest number of prisoners, with just under 1.5 million out of a total population of around 850 million, and that equates to a prison population rate of 177 per 100,000 population. Africa is number 4 on this list with a total prison population of just under 1.4 million out of a population of 1.4 billion, equating to a prison population rate of 100 per 100,000. And Oceania comes in at number 5 on the list with 63,000 people in prison out of a total population of just under 45 million, equating to a prison population rate of 141 per 100,000, which is bang on the global average. And this table shows us the change in the prison population between 2000 and the current levels. And as you can see at the bottom, in 2000, the total number of prisoners in jail was 8.6 million, compared with 11 million today. And that means that over the past 24 years, there's been an increase of around 27%. However, the official United Nations figures that were taken in mid-2023 show that that increase was actually 31%. So what we're seeing here is a rapid rise in the number of people being incarcerated in prison. Now, in terms of which continents are growing the fastest in terms of prisoner numbers, Africa has that unwanted accolade, and the official United Nations figures show that there's been a 78% increase since 2000. Now, interestingly, Oceania comes in at number 2 on the United Nations statistics at 41%. However, if we look at the latest data, it actually shows an increase of almost 84% compared with 2000. Asia is the third fastest growing country in terms of prisoner numbers, with an official increase of 27% based on the United Nations figures, but an increase of 43% based on the latest data. North and South America come in at number 4 with an official increase of 25% on the United Nations figures, but 39% on the latest data. And interestingly, the United Nations are showing an increase of just under 6% for Europe. However, the latest data shows us that the numbers have actually declined by almost 26%. But if you look at the note on this table, you'll see that excluding Russia, the total for Europe has actually increased by almost 12%. So Russia is having a huge weighting here in terms of it seeing a massive reduction in prisoner numbers, which is bucking the trend for the whole rest of the world. All of the other continents are seeing a huge increase, including Europe. However, Russia's prisoner numbers are declining rapidly. Now, before we go on any further today, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Exter. Exter makes the world's coolest wallets. They're super slim, around half the size of conventional wallets, but still allow you to carry up to 12 cards and cash. All Exter wallets have built-in RFID blocking, which protects you from data theft and wireless skimming. And Exter have also developed a super slim tracking device, which is solar powered and allows you to track your wallet's location from your phone. But the coolest thing about Exter wallets is that they provide you with quick card access, allowing you to access your cards at the click of a button using Exter's signature trigger mechanism. Exter wallets come in a variety of designs and colours, and as well as making cool wallets, Exter also make great accessories, including key cases and this uber cool tool card. And the great news is that Joe Blogs viewers can get a discount of up to 55% by using the code JOEBLOGS at checkout. So if you're looking for an uber cool gift for someone you know, or maybe you just fancy treating yourself, please click in the link below. This chart shows the countries with the largest number of prisoners as of December 2023. And as you can see, the country with the most prisoners in the world is the USA, with just under 1.8 million, followed by China with just under 1.7 million. And interestingly, when you compare the population of the USA against the population of China, the USA currently has around 340 million people compared with 1.4 billion in China. So in percentage terms, there are a lot more people in prison in the USA than there are in China. However, interestingly, the trend is different in both countries. Prisoner numbers in the USA are actually declining. Back in 2010, the total number of people in prison in the USA was almost 2.3 million, whereas in China it was 1.6 million. Brazil is the country with the third largest number of prisoners in the world at 840,000. And this compares with Brazil's current population of around 217 million. And the number of prisoners in Brazil is increasing rapidly. Back in 2010, Brazil had less than 500,000 prisoners. India is the country with the fourth largest number of prisoners at 573,000, and it's also seeing a rapid increase. Back in 2010, there were less than 270,000 prisoners, so the number has more than doubled over the last 14 years. Russia is at number 5 on this list, and interestingly, it was previously at number 3, so the numbers are coming down, and we'll go on to talk about what's happening in Russia in more detail in a moment. Turkey is at number 6 with 341,000, Indonesia 7, Thailand 8, Mexico 9, and Iran number 10. And this chart shows the countries with the largest number of prisoners per 100,000 of national population. So basically what this is showing is the percentage of the population that are in prison. And the country with the highest percentage of its population in prison is El Salvador, where there are over 1,000 people per 100,000 in prison right now. So basically, more than 1% of the population is currently in jail. The country with the second highest percentage of prisoners per population is Cuba, with 794 per 100,000, followed by Rwanda at 637, Turkmenistan at 576, American Samoa at 538, The United States comes in at number 6 on the list with 531 people in prison per 100,000 of population, so around 0.5%, followed by Panama at number 7, Guam at number 8, Palau at number 9, and Uruguay at number 10. These statistics, which have been put together by the Institute for Crime and Justice Policy Research, in conjunction with the Birkbeck University of London, show the data for Russian prisons as of the 1st of January 2023. And what this shows is that at the start of January 23, there were 433,006 people recorded as being in prison out of a total population of 144.5 million. And this meant that out of every 100,000 of population in Russia, 300 were imprisoned. Now, if we look at the stats as to what's been happening over the last 20 years, you can see that back in 2000, there were more than 1 million people in prison in Russia, and that represented 729 people out of every 100,000. So that's significantly more than double the figures that we're seeing for the start of 2023. By 2010, the figure was down to 864,000, and the percentage was down to 609 people out of 100,000. By 2015, that figure had reduced further to 672,000, and the percentage to 466. And by 2020, the number was down to 524,000 and the percentage 363. So what we're seeing here is a long-term trend for the reduction in the number of people being sent to prison in Russia. However, that situation has accelerated rapidly over the last 2 years. It's been reported that the number of people held in Russian prisons dropped by 58,000 in 2023, and in total over 105,000 prisoners were released in the last 2 years. Russia has been recruiting prisoners to fight in Ukraine since 2022, when Yevgeny Prigozhin, the late head of the Wagner Mercenary Group, began touring penal colonies, offering prisoners a pardon if they survived 6 months at the front. Prigozhin, who was killed in a plane crash in 2023, 2 months after leading a short-lived mutiny against Russia, said he had recruited 50,000 prisoners for Wagner. Russia's defense ministry has since continued recruiting convicts from prisoners for its own Storm Z formations. Regional authorities in Siberia have said that they plan to close several prisons this year amid a decline in inmate numbers driven by the recruitment of convicts for the war. And the latest calculation of prisoner numbers is that they are down to around 250,000, according to calculations by independent media. The concept of recruiting people directly from prison who are serving long-term sentences for violent crime first came to light in 2022 when a high-profile Russian called Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was very close to President Putin, he was reportedly his chef in the past, he formed a mercenary group called Wagner, and Wagner was used all around the world by Russia to go and fight in places like Africa and represent Russia without being an official representation. And Wagner was called upon in Ukraine to go to the front line and get involved in some really heavy fighting. And the reason that this came to light was that footage was leaked onto the internet of Prigozhin actually going to prisons and recruiting people directly, offering them a pardon for all of their sins in the past if they spent 6 months fighting in Ukraine. So let's have a quick look at some of that footage.
Парни, вопросы? После вопросов все в живую очередь выстраиваются на собеседование. Время на принятие решения 5 минут. Когда мы уезжаем, время заканчивается. А дальше как повезет. Вопросы гарантии доверия. Следующее. У вас есть кто-нибудь, кто может вас в десятки срока отсюда с зоны вытащить? Как вы думаете? Есть двое, кто вытаскивает. Это Аллах и Бог в деревянном ящике. Я вас живыми забираю. Но не всегда живыми возвращают.
So as you can see from that footage, there wasn't really much of an interview process here. We are talking about a 5-minute chat after that initial sales pitch, and basically anybody could sign up. It didn't really matter what you'd done in terms of your crime, what you were in prison for, what your temperament was like, whether you were fit. Nobody really cared as long as you were prepared to take on a gun and go and fight in Ukraine. And there were stories of people being given mandatory training of 1 day and then being sent to the front line. So basically, you didn't really have any training. You didn't know what you were doing. These groups of soldiers weren't soldiers in reality. They were just people who'd been plucked out of prison who were sent to go and do all of the frontline fighting. And the reason that these guys signed up was that it was a way out of jail. You were given a complete pardon. If you made it through the first 6 months, if you could stay alive for that period, then you could theoretically go back to Russia. You would have a complete clean slate. It was like none of your crimes ever happened. You could go and get a job and return to life as normal. And also, one of the reasons why they were being recruited was that they were being offered huge salaries and signing on fees, and potentially money was going to be paid to your family if you died in battle. So all of this was highly attractive from the prisoner's point of view. However, in terms of what the use of those prisoners was when they actually got to Ukraine, it was limited. And there were lots of reports of these troops actually being wiped out because they didn't have the training. They were potentially turning around and fleeing from some of the active battle because they weren't soldiers. They didn't have that same temperament. They were just people who'd been thrown into the firing line. So this didn't really prove to be a highly successful strategy from Russia's point of view in terms of creating really strong soldiers. But what it did do is give them manpower. It got bodies on the front line to keep pushing forward to try take over more land in Ukraine. Now, interestingly, it all came to a sorry end because if you've been following the channel, you'll be aware that Yevgeny Prigozhin basically became disillusioned by a lack of support from the Kremlin. He said that his troops weren't being provided with enough equipment, they weren't being given food and water and all of the essentials, and so he then declared that he was going to turn the troops around and march on Moscow. And in June 2023, he decided that he was going to launch a revolution. And he called upon all of his Wagner forces, including the 50,000 prisoners that he'd released from jail that had been signed up to work with Wagner, to go with him and take over Russia. Now, that revolution didn't last very long. It was abandoned after a couple of days. But it brought an end to the Wagner Group and the recruitment of prisoners directly into Wagner. Alongside the Wagner recruitment of prisoners directly into the mercenary troops, it's been reported that Russia was also recruiting directly from prisons to populate its Storm Z units. And the reason why people were signing up was that this offered a really lucrative way of getting out of prison and getting a full pardon. It was reported that prisoners who signed up got paid a $2,000 per month salary, which is significantly more than the average wage in Russia. They were also promised a lump sum payment of $31,000 in the event of a serious injury. And in the event that they died, their family would be given $52,000. So all of this was highly lucrative. And in addition to that, if they made it through 6 months service, they would be given a full pardon by President Putin. So a lot of prisoners decided that rather than seeing out the next 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years in prison, it was worth taking a gamble that they could survive for 6 months to get all of this money and then get a full pardon and return to Russia. However, unfortunately, it was reported that the Storm Z units had major problems, and a lot of these units were sent directly to the front line in what was referred to as the meat grinder. So this was a situation where there was heavy fighting and a lot of loss of life. And a lot of those prisoners who signed up never made it through the 6 months. And in fact, I've been looking on the internet to try to find reports of any prisoners that have successfully made it through the 6 months and have now returned to Russia and are no longer in the war. And I'm struggling to find any accounts of anybody making it through that process. So it doesn't look like many of the people who signed up with a view to getting a full pardon ever got to the end of that process. Now, as a result of the combination of a lack of training, lack of equipment, and also the fact that Storm Z units were being sent to fight in the fiercest battles, there has been reports of mutiny amongst a lot of the Storm Z soldiers. And the following video of Storm Z soldiers circulated online.
Сегодня 28 июня Вот остатки перед вами бригады «Шторм», точнее, роты. Изначально у нас было 150 человек, мы прибыли в зону СВО. После ожесточительных боев, нам не поставлялась БК, нам не поставлялись ни вода, ни продукты питания, не вывозились 300-е. До сих пор там гниют 200-е, их никто просто не забирает. Отдаются ужасные приказы, которые в принципе даже не стоило бы выполнять. Сейчас к нам приехали и сказали: пацаны, надо ехать в приют, наверное, передок, опять в мясорубку, где мы уже были.
И мы от этого не вернемся.
Суть этого обращения такова: мы, после чего мы отказываемся дальше.
So as you can see, these former prisoners were refusing to go back into Ukraine and continue fighting. And in addition to the problems being encountered by Storm Z units on the front line, there was also a huge loss of morale among Storm Z units who agreed to support Yevgeny Prigozhin in his revolution attempt.
Гнобят, гасят. Так вообще не делается, когда люди друг с другом двигаются, они двигаются ровничком, а ты, получается, нелюдь, шерстюга. Больше тебя никак назвать нельзя. Если это не так, то покажись свое мужицкое. Мы в тебе уверены.
Жень, ты подставил нас и своих ребят. Красиво базарил. Мы оказали тебе поддержку, а сейчас что? Нам уже обещают хорошую жизнь. Думаю, так же, как и твоим пацанам. Поверь, хорошие люди этого просто так не оставят.
Now, interestingly, following Wagner's failed revolution in June 2023, President Putin decided to change the way everything was operating. He disbanded Wagner and decided that everything should be controlled centrally by the armed forces, and Storm Z units were disbanded and replaced with Storm V units. And President Putin introduced a new law changing the terms and conditions being offered to prisoners. On the 24th of June 2023, President Putin introduced a new law scrapping the Storm Z situation and introducing Storm V units. And under this new law, prisoners were still offered the opportunity to join the Russian armed forces. However, they were no longer offered a full pardon at the end of their service. And in fact, they were no longer offered a minimum 6-month period. If they sign up, they now have to fight either until retirement, which is officially 65 years old, although apparently Russia is now looking to extend that fighting age out to 70, or if they're incapacitated, they're unable to continue fighting as a result of injuries, or if the war comes to an end. So from a prisoner's point of view, the length of time that you're going to have to spend in Ukraine is now significantly longer, and the risk of not making back alive is obviously much higher. However, there is still a large amount of uptake in terms of prisoners deciding that rather than spending the rest of their life in jail, they would rather take their chances and go and fight in Ukraine. Now, the problem that Russia has encountered with regards to both the Storm V and also the Storm Z units is that these people haven't been trained to be soldiers. It's reported that for Storm Z, there is a minimum period of 5 days training. However, there are still stories circulating of people receiving 1 or 2 days training. There's also a lot of stories about a lack of equipment, a lack of supplies, and a lack of direction. And these units are being sent to the front line where there is a lot of active fighting. And as a result of these conditions, there are a lot of reports of drinking and drug use, of people having very low morale, deserting the army, looking to get captured by Ukrainians to stop the fighting so that they don't run the risk of being killed. And there is also a high mortality rate amongst the Storm V and the previous Storm Z units. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the issue of recruiting people directly from prisons to join your armed forces and then go and fight in an active war is really quite interesting. This isn't something that most countries would consider. If you're going into a warfare situation, you want trained soldiers, People who've been taught exactly what to do, how to take orders, what to do in a battle situation, how to handle their equipment, and all of the things that you would associate with being part of the army. This is a lifestyle choice for most people, and when you sign up, you don't expect to be going into active service within a short space of time. You would expect to be trained and taught exactly what to do in those scenarios before you're sent into war. But what we've got in Russia is a situation where people who've had no military background at all, they've got no training, they've got no history of using firearms in a battle situation, they're being taken out of prison, being given 1 or 2 days very basic training, and then being sent to an active frontline situation. They're going to the place where it's most likely that you're going to come under fire and you could potentially be killed within hours of getting to that situation. So this is quite unusual, and I don't think in history there have been many situations like this. But as we've seen in today's video, this isn't a small number of people. We're not talking about a handful of prisoners who've been taken out of one prison. We're talking more than 100,000 people over the last 2 years. We don't have the exact numbers, but what we can see is that the prison numbers in Russia are reducing rapidly. If the most recent report of prisoner numbers now being down to 250,000 is correct, that means that it's come down by around 75% over the last 24 years. And it's less than half of what Russia had about 2 years ago. So Russia potentially is recruiting a huge number of people directly from prison to send them into Ukraine to fight the war. And we don't have any statistics in terms of the official number of people who've died, but you have to think that a large percentage of those people will have suffered in battle because they're not trained, they're not being given much direction, and they're not being given any equipment to be able to fight in the front line. So all of this looks like an absolute nightmare in terms of if you're being sent in as part of those battalions. And what we've seen is that over the last 2 years, there have been a number of changes in the way that Russia is handling this. Firstly, they were using the mercenary group WAGNER, but unfortunately, Wagner became disillusioned by the lack of support, and their leader actually decided to launch a revolution against President Putin. Now, that revolution didn't last very long, only a matter of days. And Yevgeny Prigozhin was exiled to Belarus. He was told that he was no longer welcome in Russia, and unfortunately for him, he died in a plane crash shortly thereafter. Now, the Wagner group was then replaced by Storm Z units, and this was basically using the same people from Russian prisons in battalions that were part of the Russian army. But the Storm Z people also became disillusioned. Firstly, they were hoping that the revolution that Wagner was organising would be successful. They joined in that revolution. Their card was potentially then marked, and a lot of those people then found that their units were disbanded and replaced by what was called Storm V units. And these Storm V units are also manned by prisoners. However, the terms and conditions that these prisoners are now being offered are significantly worse than they were being offered at the start of the war. But as I said, it's very difficult to find any accounts of people making it through their minimum period of 6 months and then returning to Russia to carry on as if nothing ever happened. I can't find any reports of that happening, so it looks like the majority of these people who've been taken out of prison and sent to fight in Ukraine haven't ever made it back. They're either still there or they've been injured or killed in battle. But the overall summary of today's video is that it's really interesting that Russia is now calling upon prisoners to help fight its war in Ukraine. This indicates that there is a lack of support amongst general population in Russia. Most people don't want to sign up and go and fight in Ukraine, and so they're struggling to be able to keep those numbers up. They're going to the prisons, they're getting as many prisoners as they can to go to Ukraine. But unfortunately, they don't look like effective soldiers. They're not doing a great job. There are no real positive reports of either Storm Z or Storm V units doing heroically in battle, performing well. In fact, it's predominantly the opposite. So the overall summary of today's video is that, as we saw at the start of this episode, prisoner numbers around the world are rising rapidly, more than 30% increase. However, in Russia, we're seeing the opposite trend. There is a rapid reduction in the number of people being held in prisons, and one of the reasons for that is because Russia is still recruiting people directly from prison to go and fight in Ukraine. And whilst that might look like a good idea on paper, in reality, it isn't proving to be successful because those individuals are not trained, they're not soldiers, and their battalions are not performing well in Ukraine, and very few of them are making it back alive. So although Russia is reducing the cost of its prison service by reducing the number of people in prison, it's not helping with its war in Ukraine, and overall you have to think that sending prisoners to fight your war isn't the best idea. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.